I'll be reading the Bible for us today. It'll be Colossians 1:15 to 23. It's Colossians 1:15 to 23. If you want a Bible, there are some up the back at the Connect table there. And as Sarah also said, and there's also some there in other languages other than English as well. So, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant.
Well, good morning. It's great to be able to gather, as Sarah has led us in this morning, that it's wonderful to gather as God's people. For those that I haven't met, I'm Rick. I'm one of the pastors here at Laneway. The rest of the pastors and a bunch of the other leaders at church are away at a conference for MTS. So be praying for that. Be praying that many of the people going would be encouraged to think about serving God with much of their lives. Now, there's this thing that we do each January where we, in the lead-up, we ask our neighbours, our friends, our co-workers a big question, and then we answer it over the Sundays in January. Now, for next year, we've got a question that we are keen to get people's answers to, and we'll respond to them. And you should be able to see it there. It's, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Now, the answer to that, in many ways, we'll actually see today. For us, for our benefit, we get to see that here in this passage that Adam so helpfully read for us. But I want you for a moment, turn to the person next to you, near you, find the person you know the least near you. So that's going to be a bit of a, I don't know, that might break friendships. Find someone you know the least and ask the question, what do you think, either for yourself, if you're not sure who Jesus is, who is he? How would you describe him? Or how do you think some of your friends, your neighbours, your co-workers, how might they answer that question? Who is Jesus? I'll give you 1 minute. Hopefully you've been able to get some thoughts, some ideas. Keep those conversations going after church. And it'd be great for you to think now, today, who is the friend that you're going to be able to ask that question to? We'll get that the survey question out to you this week. So have a think. Who can I ask that question to? What might their answer be? And you can invite them along as we hear the answers. I want to give you what I suspect, whether it's your friends, your neighbours or not, some of the biggest answers that the people around Melbourne's West will have. So the first is the idea that Jesus is Isa al-Masih. Isa al-Masih is a prophet. This is what a lot of our Muslim friends will say. Well, that will be their view of Jesus. He is not just a prophet, he is the greatest prophet besides Muhammad himself in their view. So very high. So all of my Muslim friends will say, yeah, we don't think he's just a person. He's very highly regarded. One of the huge differences, and there's many, from what the Bible says is that Jesus did not die on the cross. Jesus didn't die on the cross, but he was a very holy man. Another thought, this might be something that your Hindu friends might hold, or you might have come into contact with, is that Jesus is an avatar. Now, if you don't know that word in this context, that doesn't mean that he's got a blue arrow on his head, or that he's like, I actually don't know, are they blue in the movie, or one of the giant blue people? Neither of those. Avatar in Hindu thinking is that he's a particularly important person sent by the god Krishna or Vishnu, sent by him to guide people in how we're to act. I think outside of those two, one of the main thoughts will be that Jesus is a social revolutionary. If we think about him much at all, the value that he might have for many of our friends, for many of the people around us, is that he taught us how to love. Or either he showed us in his life and in his death, or he taught us, love others, the golden rule. Or for others, I've heard people mention they know that Jesus flipped tables in the temple, and they'll say, Jesus is the social revolutionary. He was aware that all institutions are broken, religious institutions particularly, and so he came just to turn it all on its head. Now, I want to suggest in a bunch of those, there is truth. There is bits of pieces that are right. But fundamentally, if we took those as they are, they're failing to see Jesus for who he actually is. So for us, if you're somebody who already trusts in Jesus, as we read this passage today, as we hear from God as he's speaking to us in his word, what we're going to see is who Jesus really is. And it's life-changing. But it's not just for us, for those of us who trust in Jesus. Who Jesus is vital for everybody. So if you don't know who Jesus is, or you're here exploring, or you really didn't know what your answer was to who is Jesus, can I say this is so vital for you as well. This is vital for you, not because it just helps you fill in a picture about what Christians think, what the Bible says, but because Jesus is that important. Jesus is that important that we all need to know who he is. He's key to understanding everything. And that's not an overstatement. He is the key to understanding everything that exists and everything that matters for you. Now, as we're thinking about some of the general thought of how people think around us, or even what might drive us, one of the common pulses of how we think about our world is we do this very good thing. Our culture has been driven by a desire to understand how the world works. And this is fantastic. There has been so many wonderful things that have come from the scientific efforts to work out how does this work? When this happens, or why is this like this? Because of this. Observation, understanding the rules, all of that is fantastic. But there's an assumption that can often underlie it, that there's no God, no divine being, no anything behind all of those rules. Now, can I suggest that's really not good? The first part is great. We want to be people who, Christians don't want to be anti-science. But we want to be so pro-science that we go not just the what and the how, but the why and the who behind it. Imagine all of life, all of the world, all of creation is like a painting. Boil it all down to just a painting. Now, as we see that painting, there are so many wonderful things that we can see in it. I'm not very good at understanding, decoding art. I feel like I don't really understand. I don't see color, as this is going to come up a lot in my sermon. So if you didn't already know that, I can't see color very well. And so there's a whole lot that I just don't know is there. But we look at it and it's beautiful, depending on the artwork. But we can see not only the techniques and the how and, I see that they did this. But there's something else that every painting should drive us to. Is not just what is there, but there's something behind, outside of the frame of that painting, the who, the artist who put it there. One of the dangers of our culture and our world is that we look at what is around us, and because we can understand some of the what and the how, we assume there is no who, there's nobody behind it. It's like looking at a painting and being able to appreciate it, and assuming that the painting just happened by accident, or We can decode how the paintbrush might have moved and all these things, but assuming there is no artist who has artfully put it all together. The challenge for us is that the artist, when we look at the world, himself is invisible. But when we look at this, when we open up, so if you don't have a Bible in front of you, as Adam and Sarah both helpfully, grab a Bible, really helpful to have you in front of you, but will also be coming up on the screen. Look at verse 15 there. The Son is the image of the invisible God. The Son is the image of the invisible God. There is an invisible artist behind all of what exists, all of creation, God. But when we look at Jesus, who through this passage is called the Son, when we look at him, he is the image of that invisible God. It's as though the artist somehow put themselves into their own painting, so that when we look at him, when we look at that, we can see God. This idea of the image of God as well isn't new here. God's used it before. If you are familiar with the Bible, you'll recognize this language from right at the start of the Bible, from Genesis 1, when God created mankind, when he created male and female. If you've got a Bible, you can either flick to it or it'll come up on the screen. But Genesis chapter 1 says, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image.'" Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground.' So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them." So God has created humanity in his image to reflect him, to be in his likeness. But did you notice the difference between how God described what was happening there in creating humans and for us? And for the Son? Well, mankind, the language is that mankind is made, created in God's image. But what does God say in Colossians? The Son is the image of the invisible God. We are supposed to reflect God, and we'll look at this more later about how we've failed in our being image bearers, that so much of what it means to rule this earth we have failed in. We were created to reflect God, but Jesus wasn't made to reflect God. He just is the image of God. He wasn't made, he wasn't created. He is God. When we look at him, when we open up the pages of the Bible and we see Jesus walking in lands that we could still visit today, we are seeing God himself. We can see his character. We can see his divinity. It's the same thing that we see in the rest of that verse, what God is saying when he calls Jesus the firstborn over all creation. Now, some have said firstborn over all creation or firstborn of all creation means that Jesus is actually part of creation. No. What it's saying is that Jesus has what the firstborn had in that time: privilege, responsibility of being the firstborn son. That is like what Jesus has. Jesus has that, but not over a family, not over a household. Jesus has that power and responsibility over all of creation. Not because he's been given it when he didn't deserve it, but because he himself is God. Jesus, when we look at him, it's the same thing again when we see in verse 19, just move your eyes down further down the page. "For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him." All of God's fullness. Again, his divinity, his character. It's not like Jesus the Son got the compassionate, the gracious, the kind parts. The Father got a whole lot of the other parts, and he's got the justice and the anger and the wrath. No, when we look at Jesus, we're seeing all of God's character in him. He isn't a lesser God. And that stands in contrast, notice, to all of those worldviews that we were talking about before. Who is Jesus? Well, he's not just a man sent by God as a holy man. He's not even a lesser God, as some will say. He is himself God. Jesus has the fullness of God dwelling in him. Now, the most basic distinction in all of the world, if we were to carve all of existence into two categories, often we would talk about that as male and female, or different races, or we would carve it down east, west, or if we were to go beyond humanity, then we could go, well, it's between humans and the rest of the world. Or you could say then it's between living beings and the rest of... There's all these different divisions you can make to try and work out how do we understand all of what exists. Can I tell you, much more fundamental than all of those, the most basic distinction in all of existence is God, creator, creation. There is creator, creation. Jesus stands on the creator side of that. Jesus is creator who steps into the creation so that we can see God. Now, when you look at a painting, I don't know how easy it is to be able to tell about, I'm assuming like handwriting, and there's all this psychology of all these things, that when you look at a painting, you might be able to tell, oh, well, this artist was very angry, because you can tell by their use of this and this and this. There's things that you might be able to deduce about the artist as you look at a painting, like as we look at the world and we see the diversity of things and the beauty and the range of everything. There's something that we can deduce about God. The Bible tells us we can see that there is an all-powerful, eternal God behind it just by looking at creation. But when we see Jesus, we're not getting a picture that there is a God. We are getting to see who he is. We can look at him and we can discover God. That huge distinction between creator and creation, Jesus, the Son, has stepped into creation so we can know him. The Son is over everything. Jesus, the Son, sits over everything because he is creator. And Paul just wants us to keep getting that same point over and over in different ways. Move into verse 16 with me. For in him all things were created. Things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. So notice a number of things there. It's like Paul is trying to map out the coordinates of what has been created by Jesus. He's trying to map out boundaries. Recently, my daughters, we introduced them to, I think, my favorite Disney movie. Well, Lucy's been asking us to rank them all, and it's gotten harder than I thought it would. The Lion King. Now, special place in my heart. First movie that I saw at the cinemas. I think it was the first movie I saw. Music, it's all incredible. Now, do you remember the scene? If you've seen it, and if you haven't, go watch it. That's your homework. Besides inviting your friends to carols and asking them the question, go watch Lion King. There is a scene in it where Simba is being told by his father the rule that they have. And he gets to a certain part in the horizon and says, but what about that shadowy place? There's a dark space outside, and Mufasa says, Simba, you must never go there. So I could do the whole movie if I wanted to. But I'm not going to do James L. Jones's voice. Because it's outside of their kingdom. It doesn't fit under their rule. They are mighty kings, but there's a limit to how much they can rule. Notice what Paul is doing here. He's drawing those boundaries. Look at what's inside of it, about what he is over, about his role with creation. First, he says at the start and at the end, all things. All things were created in him. And he finishes off again at the end of the verse, all things have been created through him and for him. All things. There's no space outside of Jesus' rule over creation, about his role in creation being. But just in case there was any doubt, in case we thought, well, what about this? No, I thought of this. He really wants, well, no, also that. Things in heaven and on earth. So from atoms to angels to antelope, everything being created through Jesus. From stars burning across the universe with the power of 100 million nuclear weapons going off every second, created through Jesus. To the array of beautiful flowers that are springing up all around us, created through Jesus. Every bird which is singing its song of praise is singing its song to Jesus. Jesus is the one that it's all within his rule. Jesus is completely over them all. But then you think, well, yeah, all of those things, they're visible. What about the invisible? He says, well, invisible as well. See that there, whether visible or invisible. Now, Jesus created our eyes with the ability to see, again, not me, but you, about 10 million colours. Now, maybe that makes sense to you. That doesn't make sense to me because I think mine is about 100,000. But even to me, 100,000 colours, that seems incredible that our eyes would be able to see that. 10 million? Everything that you can see with any of those colours that have names from blue and pink and red to all the different Dulux brand names, every single colour, Jesus created it. Everything that has that colour, Jesus created it. It was created through him. But not just those visible things. There's so much beyond what we can see with our human eyes. There's infrared light, there's ultraviolet light. There are things that are so small that we can't see them. There are angelic, spiritual beings that we can't see, that unless God opens our eyes to see them, they're invisible to us. There's even each of our own spirits. God has made us to be both physical body and spirit. Now, we can all see each other's physical bodies. We can't see each other's spirits. Jesus is over it all, whether visible or invisible. And just to round it off, even all the rulers and authorities, it's not just all the lowly things or all the inanimate objects. Jesus is over thrones and powers, rulers, authorities. It is all things have been created through him. Everything that you can see, everything you have or will, it's all been through him. It can be easy to want to look at Jesus and bring him down to be like us. And he did. He humbled himself to be a human. But he is still the God over all of it. And we would be missing out massively if we fail to appreciate that is who he is. All things, Jesus is completely over it all. But notice as well, he gives 3 prepositions. So again, another grammar lesson after last week. 3 ways that all these things have been created. Notice it in the first part of verse 16. For in him all things were created. And then at the very end, all things are being created through him and for him. In or by is probably another helpful word there. By him, through him, and for him. All things have been created. Now, a normal process would say the Bible that you're holding, physical book. Now, it's been made by a publisher. It's been put together. I'm talking about the physical book, not the words that God spoke or the people who wrote it down originally. I'm talking about just the physical production process. They have made it. There's a publisher that you could flip it over to the back or go to the page. By. That is who it's made by. Through, well, you could go to a printing house. There's a printing house that made it. The why is because Christians want to read it. Christians will buy it. You could say a whole lot of whys. For so much of what we create, for so much of the normal processes of life, there's a different by, through, and why, or for, the purpose. But with creation as a whole, the answer to all of those is Jesus. It's a much simpler flowchart in one sense. Who made it? Jesus. How? Through Jesus. Why? For Jesus. Now, in one sense, this makes all of creation so much simpler. So much simpler. Because the answer, you know the classic thing about in kids' church, the answer to everything is Jesus? It kind of is. It kind of is, because everything that you see is because of him. Let's keep moving. Verse 17. He, the Son, Jesus, is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So just to reinforce, he is before all things that are created. He isn't part of creation, he is before that. But we also say of a person when they're coping, that they're holding things together. For Jesus, he's not just holding things together, he's holding all of creation together. So not only was it created by him, he is actively now holding it together, ensuring that it is still existing. As God in Hebrews 1 says, the Son is sustaining all things by the power of his word. Jesus is over everything, friends. There is no other author behind our existence who we should listen to. Now, I remember in year 12, as I was studying English, it would really annoy me that we read these poems by a lady who I think her name was Gwen Harwood. I haven't read anything for 15 years by her. But as we would read it, they would tell us all the different whys about what she could mean. What could this mean? Well, it's like, well, this person might read it like this, or this person might read it but like this. This person might read it like this. And I remember my whole class getting quite upset, saying, can't we just find out from her? She's the author. Surely she said somewhere, when she said this line, this is what she meant. We might not be able to narrow it down, but surely we can exclude some options, because some of these things that it could mean are contradicting with each other. The author is someone that we go to find out what things mean. It's the one we listen to. There is no other author behind our existence besides the Son, besides God. We listen to him. The Son, by his word, created and sustains, and he speaks to us through his word. So friends, spend time listening to the Son. Meditate on his word, not just because you know you should, not because of a Christian guilt feeling that we don't need to have, but because, remember that flow diagram, everything makes so much more sense when we realize Jesus is over it all. We want to listen to him. We want to understand ourselves and creation and him more. Soak in his word. Meditate, drink deeply of it. But friends, as well, there's no other way that everything existed. And so I want us to be people who are thankful to him. I'm convinced it's this view of the world that Jesus is over it all, which is why we see Paul be so thankful, why we saw his thankfulness last week in the start of Colossians. It's because he gets that Jesus is over it all. And if Jesus is over it all, then every good thing that we have, every good thing that you have today and every moment is because of Jesus. And so friends, I want to give you a challenge. For every morning this week, when you wake up or at the breakfast table, I want you to think of one thing that you have because of Jesus and thank him for it. And every night as you lie down in bed, think of something in creation. Remember, there's no limits to what he's given you. Think about something that he has given you that day and simply thank him for it. So much of the reason this is hard is because we're just not good at practicing it. So every day this week, between now and next Sunday, every morning and every night, thank the Son for what he has given you. And friends, there's no other purpose for why we exist. We only exist for him. We exist for Jesus. He is the purpose of all creation. So we want to be people who praise him, who direct our purpose in life around him. We don't need to find it for ourselves. You don't need to do however many uni degrees or try however many jobs or live in however many places or explore however many countries to find your purpose. Your purpose is him. So let's praise him. Now, I've got a category that I call love eyes. It's the thing that when people are first in a relationship, everything they see reminds them of that person. They'll be walking down the street and they'll see a flower and they go, oh, they would love that flower. They're walking through Woolies and they see frozen chips and it's like, oh, they love chips. You're driving through 7-Eleven and they think, oh, they're so good at finding the best petrol prices. Love eyes. It's where everything draws you back to that person because you love that person so much. Now, not romantically, but I want us to have those love eyes for Jesus in the sense that everything that we see, I want us to go back to him and think, wow, Jesus must love beauty. Look at what he's given us. Wow, he is so powerful and creative to give us this, which helps us so much to all the variety of tastes that, wow, that was Jesus. How good would it be if we were a people who had those eyes to see everything like that? You don't need to look anywhere else in creation, though, for your purpose, because when you see them, you look to Jesus. There's a man who has been mentioned multiple times here, and I think most of them by me probably, C.S. Lewis. I highly respect this man. Wonderful. As you may know, our second daughter is named after Lucy from Narnia. C.S. Lewis is fantastic. He has this quote which I think is so on point. Listen to it. If we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. Now see the intelligence in that there's something, if we're looking in this world and we just go after thing and thing and thing and thing, chances are that thing is not what we were made for. As much as I respect C.S. Lewis, I'm going to amend that slightly. I've used this a lot and I think about it a lot. But I want to say, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in all creation can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for the Son, that we were made for God. We weren't made for anything in that creation. It's not just that we were made for another world. The reason that other world, that new creation is so good is because Jesus is there. Not just because there's no sin and suffering and death, although that will be wonderful. The reason it's so wonderful is because we get to be with Jesus. So if you're looking at the things of this world, it's like, well, why isn't any of this satisfying? It's because that's not what you were made for. Those things were supposed to be a sign to point you to him, who you were made for. Friends, look to him in everything. Now, we could easily stop there. We could very easily stop there. It's almost impossible to get bigger than the bounds that Paul has given us so far. Everything in all creation, Jesus is over it and it's for him. But Paul continues. Not because he's discovered a category that he forgot, because all things in all of creation are heading to a point. As Sarah so helpfully helped us think about earlier, that we are in the church. And the church is the thing that all of creation is heading towards, where God will save a people for himself. That is us. We are actually part of this destination for all of history to be heading towards. And so Paul wants us to be very clear that Jesus isn't just over all creation, but the pinnacle of all creation, the pinnacle of what God's doing in the world, bringing a people for Jesus. Jesus is over that too. The Son is over all creation, but he's also and particularly over the church. Have a look at verse 18 with me. And he, the Son, is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. He is the head of this church. So Josh, when he is here, can rightly introduce himself as the lead pastor of Laneway. But Josh would be the first to say he is not the head of this church. Jesus is. And not just this church, but every church and all of the people that God has saved, who are both alive now and have been saved and will be saved. Jesus is over them all. He is the head. How? Well, because he is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead. Death is called the great unknown. The great unknown. But for Jesus, it's not. It's not unknown for Jesus because Jesus has not only come and humbled himself to be like us, to be the artist in the painting, but he also suffered death on our behalf and was raised back from the dead. So not only is he the firstborn over all creation, he's also the firstborn from among the dead. So that in all of this creation and in the next, where God renews everything, where God raises people from the dead, all those who've trusted in him, he is the firstborn over that as well. He is supreme over that as well. Jesus is like a king who is going to a truly untouched land that no one has ever gone because it was far too dangerous. There was no way through. There was no way to get there. He has gone there. He has made it through death and have victory over it so that all of us who are in him will make it there as well. Jesus is over all creation and he is over the church because he is the firstborn from the dead. Now, as I was listing all those things that Jesus is over, all those things in creation, mapping out those coordinates, I don't know for you, but it could be very easy to have the question, what does sin do here? If everything is under Jesus, if everything is supposed to have him as king, if he is supposed to be God over all of it, then what is sin doing? How does this work with sin? Because sin is the very denial of him as king, of him as God. Sin is denying that. How does sin fit into this picture? Well, friends, I want to take you then to verse 21. So move down to verse 21 with me. Paul acknowledges that. Once you were alienated from God, and you were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. Sin breaks the relationship with us and Jesus, but not in the sense that it stops him being over everything. Sin doesn't destroy Jesus' crown, it just denies it. Sin doesn't stop Jesus ruling over everything and sitting on the throne. It just robs us of the pleasure and the joy and the blessings of being able to be seated around that throne, of being his subjects. That's what's best for us. Sin destroys that. It causes a rift, and that rift goes all through that creator-creation divide, so that everything in all creation, because we were made in God's image, everything in all creation is groaning, is being subject to futility because of our sin. Jesus is over it all, but we have rejected him. And yet, just as God the Father was pleased that Jesus is fully God, he's also pleased that Jesus would be the way that all things would be reconciled back to him. Have a look in verse 19 and 20. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Peace is hard to find in our world. Peace is hard to find. That's been particularly acute for Ellen and I over the last 2 years, more than any other time, not because of in between us. We're fine. But because of Ellen's family in Ukraine. Her family in Ukraine, and all of a sudden, the realization of the cost of a lack of peace that it has on people's lives, seeing how devastating it is, seeing what it's like for their kids to not know why this is happening, to not be able to understand the world, to be growing up knowing people hate us. Why do they hate us? And then over the last few months, it's become acute in a different way for us in that our plans are to go to the Middle East. And then we're looking at what's happening in the Middle East and thinking, how is this happening? Peace is so hard to find. But Jesus has made peace. There are wonderful expressions of churches where Russians and Ukrainians are gathering and worshipping the sun together. Where Palestinians and Israelis are worshipping the sun together. That peace is only possible because of the blood shed by Jesus on the cross, because of the peace that God has won for them, for us. I don't know your family backgrounds. I don't know if you've experienced that acute pain, whether you're here in Australia because your parents or your grandparents were fleeing from a lack of peace, from war. Footscray has a lot of people who fled war. But friends, as terrifying and terrible as those wars are, the lack of peace between humanity and God is far worse. And that's why it can be in the church that those people can worship together, that they can love each other. Because they don't just have peace with each other, they have peace with God. The biggest rift, the biggest divide is mended. The smaller ones can now be fixed too. That's what we're going to celebrate in a moment as we share communion together. But before we do, I want us to just see that in all of this, Paul doesn't just say all of this so that we have some theology, we understand Jesus is God over creation. All of that is fantastic, and it should be shaping not just our minds, but our hearts and everything that we do and love. But he gives at the end both confidence and a warning. Confidence and a warning. Look at verse 22. In view of all this, he says, "But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death, to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation." Friends, there is no challenge bigger that you would have faced besides the challenge of being right with your God. And God, Jesus the Son, he is the one who has won it for you. So that on that last day, when Jesus returns and we stand before him as the judge of all, the judge of you, you can stand there because you've trusted in Jesus, because of what he's done, you've trusted in his blood, you will be holy in his sight. You will be clean. That is how he will see you, without blemish. For there is no one who can accuse you. That is a wonderful confidence, that for whatever might shake us in our lives, you can have that confidence. Not because of yourself, but because of Jesus. But it's not just a confidence, there's also a warning. Continue verse 23 with me. "You will be this if you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel." Friends, don't move from the gospel. Don't be someone who comes to church, who is happy to celebrate, but then when the challenges come of what it means to call yourself a Christian, when the reality of sin and pain makes this harder, don't be moved. Hold firmly onto Jesus. He is over everything. He is over you. He has won you by his blood. Stand firm. Don't look, friends, anywhere else but Jesus for the meaning in your life. Only look to him. I'm going to pray that God would form us to be people who are so shaped by his Son that we would forever stand firm and established in him. And then we're going to share in communion together. Jesus, we thank you that you are the Son. You are the one who is over everything. Thank you that we don't need to look for our purpose and meaning in anything else. Help us to see it all and make it drive us to you. Fill us with a thankfulness and a joy because of what you have done. Thank you for the peace that you have won for us. Hold us so that we can stand free from accusation on that last day. Amen.